enhanced moral character requires multiple virtues.
So in my talk, I want to do a couple things. The first is, as a long-time consequentialist and only recent convert to the utility of virtue theory, I want to make some brief comments about the consilience or the compatibility and the utility for the moral enhancement argument of addressing virtue theory. Then I want to talk a little bit about how we might enumerate virtues, given the great deal of dissensus about what kinds of virtues there might be, and then propose my own framework of virtue and how I've been using it to parse some of the issues in moral enhancement. So first, I think if you become more familiar with virtue ethics traditions, both religious and secular, you'll find that there is a lot of recapitulation of the arguments that have been articulated within those traditions in our more recent moral enhancement debates. One issue I think that we've seen in the debate over whether it's free or not to transform your character in a morally enhancing way harks back to a lot of issues around the authenticity of one's sinful nature and whether you're in fact more free once you try to transform your nature or not. There's a lot of issues which we just heard of if you were to enhance one single virtue in one unilateral direction, there might be unintended consequences of doing so that would be negative for society, or it would at least be inadequate in other ways. And that is an issue that's been widely addressed in virtue theory about the necessity of virtues being in a balance and an ecology and developing over a course of moral education so that they can be expressed appropriately in different circumstances. And so this is partly to address some of Nick Agar's concerns about the relationship between moral education as a developmental process in which various kinds of virtues can be expressed in a more balanced way. And then I think there's also a strong and developing argument about the natural consilience of virtue theory with the emerging neuroscience, although I'll show that it's not as consilient as some have argued. So one broad issue about the relationship between virtue and moral enhancement is the relationship of reason and emotion, which we started with some this morning. Is it sufficient to simply enhance cognition? Or do we also have to enhance moral sentiment? And I think that almost all virtue traditions argue that there needs to be a reform in both moral sentiments and in moral reasoning. They both, for instance, in Buddhism, this is like the central conundrum of how you integrate wisdom with compassion. Aristotle distinguished between those who were wicked, who did not understand cognitively the good, and those who were incontinent, those who understood cognitively the good but were incapable of controlling their own passions and sentiments in order to be good. Within more contemporary moral theory, we see the debate between Kohlberg and Gilligan, of which I'm more a fan of Kohlberg, but at least that debate was what's the relative importance of moral reasoning and versus empathy and compassion and figuring out the good. And I think many have concluded, well, both are important to some extent. And then more recently, Damasio, who harks back to Hume in trying to argue and show that reason is itself a tool of the emotions, and that without emotions, we can't even come to any kind of decision, so that the two are inextricably combined from the very beginning in our cognition, that we can't really think without emotions. So this is an old issue in virtue theory, and one that I think we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel on. And at the most broad level, my suggestion is we can learn from virtue theory that it's important to both address our vices, our addictions, our distracting impulses, learn self-control and other aspects of sentiment control, as well as to enhance cognition and moral reasoning, which I'll address in a second. Part of this is in order to create a system of a balance of virtues, in which one virtue will situationally control another and keep it from going into an extreme, and keep us from becoming moral monsters where we only exemplify one set of virtues versus another. And for Aristotle, this was central to his concept of phronesis, the notion that through a moral education, one would develop a sophistication about which were the operative virtues in any one situation and how to apply virtues in different situations. And one of the reasons why case-based education works very well in general. In a Buddhist context, this is central to the notion of skillfulness. The Buddhists don't talk about ethical, but they use the term kusala, which means to be skillful, and to learn the skillfulness of the appropriate application of different kinds of ideas and ethical ideas in different situations. And that's called the virtue of upaya, or skillful means in liberation. So the framework that I imagine here is that over time we will get beyond the reductionism of saying, well, why don't we give people serotonin to jack this up, or why don't we give them oxytocin to jack this up, and have a more sophisticated model of character development, one that's already been worked on in various ways, ways of measuring character development, and then move beyond our Luddite antipathy to the use of ADHD stimulant drugs and so forth, to include those in that fuller model of how character development might be enhanced by situationally different kinds of drugs and devices. For me, that would, for instance, look like something that Buddhists did in the Abhidharma, which is a whole third of the Buddhist corpus, is Buddhist psychological analysis. And one of the things that they do in that text is talk about the different kinds of personality types. So a monk could diagnose you basically as someone whose principal problem is aversion, and so anger is your principal vice, and there are particular meditations to do then, therefore, if you're an angry person. Compassion would be that kind of a meditation. And this might occur developmentally. You might be angry at one point in your life, and you might be acquisitive at another, and have to do different meditations at different points. In the same way, we might have this kind of diagnostic developmental approach to moral education, which incorporates Ritalin at one point and oxytocin at another. And for me, as a transhumanist, this is a part of a project of moving beyond a purely libertarian notion of a complete agnosticism about what the ideal forms of future character might be, but to be more specific, still liberal, but more specific about the fact that it is in fact better to have a flourishing life than to be an addict of methamphetamine, and so on, to be specific that there are better ways of being in the world than others. And it's also to be specific that, or to make the point, which Froding has made, for instance, that many virtue theories, secular and religious, and consequentialist theories, make quite extraordinary demands on human beings, which we have many ways of trying to evade and elide, and say we can't possibly live up to those possible demands. But that moral enhancement, the project of moral enhancement, in fact, enables us to become more saintly, and to live up to some of the demands of virtue theory. And for instance, Peter Singer's consequentialism would argue for a level of argue that we should all commit to a level of self-sacrifice, which most of us are incapable of committing to currently, but which might become more possible in the future. And then this book, actually, John Doris's book, is a book about situationism, which is another counter-argument to the notion of moral character, which tries to point out the ways in which we're inconsistent across different situations and the weakness of moral character, essentially, the weakness of character traits across situations. And I think this is also an argument for a heightened version of moral enhancement that would make us more consistent, the kinds of consistency that we would like to see across situations. So to turn to the enumeration part of the argument, I've been very influenced by both McIntyre and Nussbaum and Sen when trying to think about what virtues are. And one way to think about it is that they're philosophically defined concepts, so abstracted concepts, for very socially specific, and this is the McIntyre point, very socially specific sets of capabilities. And they are, in fact, capabilities, so Nussbaum and Sen would make that point. But they're enabled ultimately by our neurology. I mean, if we ultimately have to bring this back, for a moral enhancement point of view, to neurology and figure out what the relationship is between these abstract concepts the sociological definition of our roles and responsibilities as capabilities, and then how that fits onto physiology, neurophysiology. And unfortunately, those are not isomorphic. The various definitions of virtues in the world are not isomorphic to particular neurotransmitters or particular parts of the brain. So we have to come up with some kind of hybrid model of doing this. So if you investigate the a priori versions of virtues in the world, Plato, Aristotle, the Greeks, Aquinas, the Buddhist 6 and 10 paramitas. There are many overlaps, but there's also a great deal of dissensus, and we see, in fact, that there has been moral evolution over time because some versions of ethics include things like the duty to die a righteous death in battle, and others say, no, well, that's one we can leave behind. And so we have immediately that problem at the level of any kind of a priori. There's no universal consensus about this. But there is this interesting effort in the States on the part of what's called the positive psychology movement to create a meta theory of virtues that would incorporate most of the extant virtues that different traditions talk about. And they have created this system of 6 virtues, which are wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence, and then 24 subordinate virtues underneath those. And they've come up with a set of survey instruments, and you can do this online if you go to their website. Take the survey to measure your own character strengths and to what extent you think you yourself have exemplified one or another of these virtues, all 24 of them, and you get a score for each of the 24. And then you can say, well, I seem to be weakest on courage, and so I could do these courage exercises to work on courage. So this has been one very interesting effort in the United States. And recently, McGrath took 500,000 of these instruments that have been filled out, so it's like 300 questions or so, and subjected them to factor analysis, a statistical technique to look at their underlying structures, and did not find the underlying structures that Seligman and the other positive psychologists had posited for them, these a priori, what seemed to make sense of how they fit together, but found instead that people who said that they were fairly high on fairness also tended to be fairly high on kindness and fairly high on teamwork and fairly high on leadership, and vice versa, fairly low on those things. So those were interpersonal strengths. Then there were emotional strengths, strengths of self-restraint or self-control, spirituality strengths, and then intellectual strengths, learning, curiosity, appreciation of beauty, and so forth. So appreciation of beauty had been in the original model under transcendence, but in this case it turned out to be loaded more heavily with the intellectual virtues and people's self-assessment. So this is another crack at this to try to kind of do a psychostatistical model. I think another interesting model that we have to grapple with is John Haidt's system of moral intuitions. I'm very much fond of the way that he's parsed these out, not at all fond of the conclusions he's drawn from this. But he basically concludes that there are 5 moral intuitions that we have inherited from our simian ancestry, 2 of which have become the basis of Enlightenment morality and have been articulated into the basis of liberal democracy, which is that you shouldn't push other monkeys out of the tree, you should be nice to other monkeys, and that you should divide things fairly or at least punish cheaters. So the kind of fairness impulse and the not harming impulse. But there are 3 other impulses that he's identified, which are more central to conservative ethics, and those are deference to authority, in-group favoritism, and disgust at impurity, or the desire to respect sanctity. And the disgust at impurity drives things like our disgust at homosexuality, or our disgust at interracial marriage, and things like that. So obviously, from an Enlightenment point of view, there are some, what Haidt points out, is that there are some virtues which have been considered virtues in many virtue systems, which are in fact not virtues in our Enlightenment version of values, and which we in fact find neurophysiologically that the people who are able to resist these older impulses of deference to authority or sanctity are the people who have more powerful cortexes and less powerful amygdalas. So the more powerful the signals from your amygdala, your fear center in your brain, the more you respond to these conservative moral impulses. And the stronger your cortex is, the more your cortex, based on liberal democratic values, tells your amygdala to shut up, the more liberal you are, the more of a Democrat you are. So this is, I think, an important refinement of the model, that not all virtues are virtues that we need to respect. And then finally, there's the growing model personality theory, which I think is probably the closest we get to the underlying genetic and physiological structure of the human brain so far as it relates to behavior. And so we have open-mindedness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and lack of neuroticism, all of which have been demonstrated to be about half inheritable, in which we're now beginning to identify specific gene sequences, dopaminergic sequences, serotonergic sequences, which correspond to a tendency to one or another of these behavioral traits. And all of these have moral implications. So agreeableness, people tend to be higher on certain kinds of teamwork skills and things like that. Neuroticism, they tend to be more self-absorbed and less compassionate and less volunteering and so forth. So all of these have moral implications, these personality theories. So briefly, in conclusion, I want to just draw out 6 possible virtues that I think might represent a hybrid model of some of these different kinds of considerations. And these are the basis of this book that I've been writing called Cyborg Buddha, rather. The first, of course, is self-control, which is strongly implicated neurologically in dopaminergic gene variations, our tendency to different kinds of addiction, our tendency to be able to not swallow marshmallows when we're 2 years old if we're given one and told that we'll get to later. There's also implications in terms of the idea of ego depletion, or the amount of blood sugar that it takes to use and exercise willpower over time in our brain, and how we might have greater or lesser capacities there. The personality trait that this corresponds to is conscientiousness, seems to be strongly correlated to this trait of this virtue of restraint, prudence, perseverance, self-regulation. And of course, at one end of the capacity for lack of self-control, we diagnose children and adults with ADHD, or they develop addictions and have other kinds of pathological diagnoses. And then we have treatments, stimulants, treatments to suppress addictions, and treatments to boost willpower, which could be directly used for moral enhancement in this domain. You may not be able to see this, but this says, libertarians make bad lifeguards. And this is a libertarian lifeguard watching people drown. So around the virtue of caring, there's a lot of neurology, we've heard a lot of it today, but there's the research on mirror neurons, the importance of a theory of mind, which is also probably localized in the brain, the role of oxytocin, although it's complicated because of its in-group loyalty dimension, serotonin, which is also complicated because it does make you aversive to harming others, but sometimes you need to harm others in order to carry out other moral obligations, and so forth. But we're beginning to identify dimensions of caring. It's strongly related to 2 personality dimensions, agreeableness and extroversion. And of course, the virtues, empathy, kindness, teamwork, and so forth. The virtue of fairness. Now, as I said, the psychostatistical method found that people who tended to see themselves as fair also tended to see themselves as caring. So it may be that we find that some of these virtues are very closely related in terms of their underlying neurology or neurochemistry in the way that they vary among human beings. But this is one where a priori, there is a strong difference between caring and fairness. You can care about people and not necessarily be fair, or you can care so much that you're not fair. You can care about your children and not be fair to others. But this issue of fairness is one where we have to be careful about the neurology, because it seems that the neurology that we've inherited around fairness, the moral intuitions around fairness, are pretty much about punishing cheaters. And that can be easily mobilized to, for instance, be opposed to welfare. If you see people who are on the dole as cheating society, you can, or immigrants as being cheaters, or people of other minorities as being cheaters, that can be easily mobilized. So this is another example of why we need a system of virtues where certain kinds of wisdom or phronesis or a broader understanding of the world balance and temper the impulses that we might inherit from any particular moral virtue or moral instinct around fairness. It has to be directed at the 1% as opposed to immigrants. I think also, as I'll mention in a second, mindfulness, self-awareness is one that greatly enhances fairness, because our capacity to overcome cognitive biases, to actually exemplify fairness, we have to be able to recognize the ways in which we're treating people unfairly, our implicit racism, for instance, to be able to have the self-awareness of when we're manifesting that and when we're not. Mindfulness, I think, is where I'm sneaking in the Buddhism, but if you look at the systems of moral virtues of the Lakota or Aristotle or so forth, you don't see very much that would be implicated in attentional control or attentional training. But I think there's a growing body of literature about the importance and the capacity to enhance moral sensibilities through meditation and through neurofeedback, and of course stimulant drugs and modafinil and other drugs that increase our capacity to pay attention to our own behavior. So again, self-control is one aspect. Self-control is not having overwhelming impulses that make us behave immorally, and having the capacity to suppress or control our overwhelming impulses, eventually make them go away, hopefully. But mindfulness is different. Mindfulness is our capacity to pay attention to ourselves and others and to be aware of the consequences of our own actions. And so our capacity to pay attention to others here as a virtue. And finally, wisdom and intelligence, not only the ability to know which is the operative virtue in each particular situation, but more broadly, to have skill at making good decisions. And this is very strongly related to our personality traits of open-mindedness, our tolerance for ambiguity. It's one of the reasons why liberals are more intelligent than conservatives, is because liberal brains in general are less aversive to ambiguity, more able to take in lots of different kinds of information. And they're spirituality, less likely to become fundamentalists. They're more in touch with their body. They appreciate beauty and food to a greater life orientations of gratitude, with optimism, hope, humor, zest for life. And again, the older traditions would have us meditate, do yoga, fast, do sweat lodges and things like that. More recently, there's a great deal of research on psychedelics, a great paper recently called Moral Transhumanism that argues on the benefits, the moral benefits of psilocybin, a psychedelic drug that have long-lasting effects. And more generally, the notion that SSRIs one of the effects of SSRIs appears to be encouraging neurogenesis, the growth of new neurons in our brains, which enable this kind of neural plasticity, which enable these new kinds of capacities. So in conclusion, what I'm arguing for is that we take seriously these older traditions, secular and religious, that have talked about human personality in a virtue framework, and try to learn the ways in which they might inform the integration of these different virtues into a system of character development, character cultivation, character education. And to integrate the chemical and genetic and cybernetic modifiers with these behavioral and pedagogical methods, older existing methods of character development, because I don't see any reason why they can't be, unlike Nick, well integrated into those models. And to integrate the modification of impulses and sentiments with the enhancement of moral cognition, which again, I think both are necessary and both can be done. Thank you.
My name is Matea, and I'm in Croatia, but I'm doing my PhD at KU Belgium. Thank you very much to both lecturers for these excellent, extraordinary presentations. I would like to ask you about, you've been mentioning the virtue ethics and secular and religious origins for these virtue ethics, but I would have problems, when you have been now listing those virtues, in a sense of, it's perfectly clear that we need to be informed. That's the most beautiful thing. We are recognizing that we are differing on so many levels among each other. So this kind of universalistic idea of human nature and human dignity and these kind of essentialist arguments are under the question with this kind of genetics and neurology, etc., etc. But my question is, when you are looking at this kind of virtues proposed by you from the procedural level, it looks like manualistic tradition in Catholic Church, sins, and then how we will do confession, and who sinned how, profiling the person. So person acts in context. we could measure it teleologically. There is certain purpose of this action. We could measure it deontologically. There are certain rules, and there are certain rules according which games should be done. According to Martha Nussbaum and Alastair McIntyre, it is beautiful to see about this moral imagination, the trust that we are again giving to the moral agent. But my question is, after the Enlightenment, after this huge disappointment, after erasing the telos, now we are living in a stage of having no telos of no telos, became telos of techne. So this is my question. So since we are presupposing Enlightenment ideas, and we are having technology, and even from Catholic tradition, we could object on this procedural shaping the personality.
Okay.
Do you understand? So the tension between, from Jean-François Lyotard, we know that these mega narratives cannot exist.
Right. So one of the problems with the Enlightenment is its self-undercutting nature, because it's raised rationality to the point where it says we really don't have any rational argument for why one state of being is better than another. So we can't argue to one another why you shouldn't take methamphetamine and just lie in the gutter until you die. And I'm not content with that. So part of my move is to say I'm committed to Enlightenment values, but I think Enlightenment values are not self-defensive or self-referencing, or you need something else to add to the Enlightenment. For instance, your argument is that the Enlightenment was a superior development over current values. But my argument would be that there are certain values, certain virtues that we need civically to encourage in order to support the Enlightenment, in order to support liberal democracy, right? If we just say, believe whatever you want, that's like saying, oh yeah, Taliban, the Nazis can run for election, now whoever wins, it'll be fine. No, we say there's certain conditions, there's certain kinds of values that people have to be committed to in this society. We're going to teach them to our children in the schools, and we're going to try to encourage them because they're necessary for the kind of society we want to have. So that's what I would say to your question, is that we need to have a model of the ideal. It has to be broad, it has to be liberal, but we need to have a model of the ideal personality, the prerequisites of civic virtue that defend and that support the kind of future that we want to have. Otherwise, we could go in all kinds of directions, directly into existential extinction, or kinds of societies that we don't want to live in.
Right. Now I've got three speakers. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Tara.
And then it's Nick and
Listen.
Yeah. So three speakers, and we've got another 10 minutes, roughly.
Who's next?
Sorry.
Okay, I'll be short. Thank you for your talk. I agree that an integrative approach to moral enhancement is very important, but I also think we should think a little bit further and actually think about which kind of training you're going to give to which kind of person, individual. For example, raising self-awareness won't work. It's more of a comment, not a question. Raising self-awareness won't work in all individuals. It might raise fairness in some, and it might raise empathy in some, but not in all. And enhancing cognition, for example, won't work in everyone. If you raise it in someone with psychopathic traits, it will make them more psychopathic. So I also think we need to think about individuals and not only about the integrative approach. It won't work. Even an integrative approach won't work for everyone.
Well, but I think you're arguing against your case, so let me explain myself a little bit more clearly. One of the things that led me to this conclusion, or the importance of this conclusion, is research on psychopaths, where they gave psychopaths oxytocin to see if it would overcome their psychopathy, and it only made them better psychopaths. Because the problem with their psychopathy was not that they didn't understand other people's emotions. The better that they understand other people's emotions, the better able they were to hurt them, right? That they didn't have the impulse to control the wanting to not hurt them, right? So there's there's all kinds of things that have to go together to come together to be a moral person who doesn't want to hurt somebody else. You have to have the impulse to be nice to them, the impulse to understand their feelings, the theory of the mind, and so forth. So
I agree, but we also have to be careful about what kind of training we give to what kind of person.
But so I'm agreeing that you don't want to just give oxytocin to the psychopath. You have to also overcome the impulse to want to hurt people. So that's where this kind of diagnosis of what is your particular moral liability, which may sound Catholic, but that's the reason it's a 2,000-year-old institution. It got some things right? It lasted for a very long time for some reasons. So the notion that we might learn from institutions that have been about the character formation from a very long time, about how you might diagnose different personalities and treat them with different kinds of treatments, I think is important.
And a small comment, you mentioned the evocation work, and you probably know Rob Kurtzman from UPenn.
I don't think so.
No, he's an evolutionary psychologist, and he published a paper in 2010 in evolutionary psychology. They tried to replicate the work by Baumeister, and they didn't find the same results, and then other labs did. So you might want to look into that.
I will, but it seems like there's substantial evidence that...
Well, but they all come from Baumeister's lab, right?
You think? Okay,
Yeah.
I'll take a closer look. It wouldn't be the first time a naive sociologist has misled by neurology. So.
Nick.
Sort of a kind of just a broad programmatic question. And I wonder, sort of, I guess you've got quite an ambitious sort of take on the virtues there. And I wonder what sort of scope there was for me as sort of someone with a liberal sort of intuition to basically reject some of the things on your list. For example, but the great thing about, I guess, the traditional virtues is they present as kind of minimal, whereas your sort of more imperialistic list sort of is, there are a lot of things I should be doing, and I should be open to a lot of quite sort of transformative chemical agents. So what scope for me, what scope is there for me to say I reject all the stuff on your, analytic philosophers are notably non-transcendent, I reject all that stuff on that list, and I reject it for my kids too.
Well, I'm not a pure voluntarist in the sense that I do think we have an obligation to one another to uphold certain kinds of characterological goals, to, for instance, provide public psychological screening and say it's not okay to be schizophrenic, and if you're harmful to yourself and others, we're going to give you certain kinds of treatments and so forth. I think there are certain ways in which we have to establish the bounds of what the kinds of personalities we want to allow, and then within that talk about how, well, okay, you can be that eccentric, you could reject beauty, say, or well, here's a real case. So I have a strong debate with the autistic community. There are people in the autistic community, usually not their caregivers, but some people on the high-functioning autist spectrum, who argue that autists are in fact morally superior to the next version of humanity because they don't care about what other people think, they don't have any theory of mind that distracts them from the tasks that they have to do. And I argue from a kind of virtuistic point of view that in fact having a theory of other people's minds is a very important dimension of human experience, and that while I may not want to force any autistic adult to get a therapy, if we had a therapy that cured a child's autism, and a parent decided that they didn't want to treat their child with autism, I would have a serious problem with that. Just as I would say, if you decide that you're not going to give your child with PKU, with the PK retardation gene, if you're not going to give them the appropriate diet to keep them from developing retardation, well, that child should probably be in someone else's care.
If I was imagining something more minimal than that, we're not so...
Right, but sight, the capacity to see, the capacity to hear, and the capacity to understand other people's feelings, these are the kinds of things that we're already arguing about. Right? So in the future, we probably will have arguments about, well, should we allow parents to allow their children to be morally blind in this particular way, or to not have this particular virtue? And there will be moral dissensus about that, and we're already dealing with that kind of moral dissensus. Right? And we have ways within the liberal democratic society to have that argument, and sometimes the people who want liberality win, and sometimes they don't.
Okay, last question.
Okay. Second, I support your idea to use Buddhism for development of the moral improvement or virtue improvement. But my question is how
sorry, you probably have to speak up a bit, otherwise you're at the back.
Sorry. How we could then make a kind of universal language of virtue, and then should we need back to more karmic idea of visualization of pain, or sort of economy of pain. So my idea is that visualization of experience of pain, not really physical or psychical pain, is something what we could use in that development of virtues. So I mean, if you share, how could you force one terrorist to share the same virtue with you or with victim? Except that you make some means that could make visualization in brain of the terrorist what is experience of the pain.
Okay, well, I hear two questions there. First is a kind of meta-ethics question, and the second is a question about consequentialism. So let me address them sequentially. First, the meta-ethics question. Sam Harris has recently written a book where he tries to solve the meta-ethics problem by saying, well, it's obvious that liberal democracies solved all kinds of problems in the world, made people happy and wealthy. And I say, when I talk to my students about this, I say, look, the Taliban would not accept the conclusions of Sam Harris's book, right? There is no meta-ethical solution that squares the difference between the Taliban's conception of the good and ours. So there is no, it's precisely by talking about suffering as a metric, which might be the useful one to figure out which is the appropriate system of values, you're making reference to ethical precedents that are Enlightenment precedents. So I don't know how to get out of the meta-ethical box. I'm comfortable with my Enlightenment presuppositions on all of these things. However, with the second problem, I'm no longer comfortable with a hedonic consequentialist approach to these questions. And part of the reason is, as a transhumanist, I'm pretty sure that in a couple of years, decades, whatever, we're all going to have little pharmacopoeia inside our brains, little wires, little capacities to jump into experience machines that will be able to be just as happy as we want, lying limbless in a gutter. There's a quick dead end from a transhumanist point of view to hedonic consequentialism, which is what attracted me to Sen and Nussbaum, because precisely defining the outcome that you want from a public policy or a set of prescriptions like the ones I'm offering is that you want to develop a broader set of human capabilities which we broadly find valuable, which many people find valuable. And that's what attracts me to the definition here of virtues as being socially defined capabilities, which also is Alistair McIntyre's point. So to talk about why we today value certain kinds of courage, but we no longer value the importance of dying a virtuous death in battle, because that's no longer considered a valuable. It is in certain circumstances. Actually, among the Marines in the U.S., certain martial cultures still consider that an important martial value. But generally, because we live in a more pacific culture, we don't have to walk around trying to die a virtuous death. And I think that that's moral progress. But it also points up the socially defined nature of these capabilities. I hope that answers your question.
Yes. Well, we've heard you out, all of you.
Thank you.
So that's the end of today.